So we're on goal 6, imperialism. So we're going to look at listing 3 reasons or goals for imperialism in the late 1800s, and we have to explain each. One of the first goals is economic markets. The second is military bases, and the third is this white man's burden, our Anglo-Saxon superiority. So when we look at economic markets, the United States has built up its industrial base. So in the north, you had the factory systems. Americans can only buy so much stuff. So America starts looking abroad. They start looking at other countries to buy their stuff. European countries aren't interested because they have their own industrial base, so they could care less. The people who actually don't have a factory system going on would be places in Latin America, Asia, Africa. America's not interested in Africa because Europe has already diced Africa up for itself, and it was called the Scramble for Africa. So really by the 1900s, the early 1900s, Africa was basically a colonized area, an area where Europeans pretty much dominated and took over every place. So America looks at Latin America and they look at Asia. And so we look at these places because they don't have the factories. So the US wants to sell our factory, our manufactured goods to Latin America and Asia. And in exchange for those goods, they're going to give us money, but they're also going to give us raw materials for our factories. They'll give us produce, particularly in Latin America. So the second goal is military bases. If you actually want to take over places, you have to have a pretty strong military. You also want to have a strong military to enforce U.S. foreign policy. So the U.S. is going to want to establish military bases around the globe. And it's kind of like chess. We're positioning ourselves around the globe. So if anybody messes with us, we can strike. We can go ahead and attack. We can put down any little rebellion that might go on. So when the Chinese nationalists, the Boxers, the Boxer Rebellion, they decide that they don't want America trading with China and they actually rebel, the US and other European countries are going to put them down because they have military in the area. The third reason or the third goal of imperialism is this thing called white man's burden, our Anglo-Saxon superiority. When white men, our Anglo-Saxons, were looking around the world, they felt that it was their responsibility to take care of any minorities. This is why the U.S. conquers places in Latin America and Asia, because in Latin America and Asia, it's not a Anglo-Saxon racial base. And so America and European countries are going to feel justified in what they do. So they'll expand Christianity, they'll expand democracy in these areas. That's what they're trying to do. So what are the 3 causes of the Spanish-American War? The Delome letter, Spanish ambassador Delome, he's going to call our president McKinley a weak, kind of girly guy. And he says that President McKinley only loves the American people and would be too scared to anger them by actually starting something with Spain. And the reason why he's saying this is because we know what's happening in Cuba with the reconcentration camps. And remember, the reconcentration camps are where the Spanish are putting all the Cubans who are kind of anti-Spanish rule in Cuba. Then the sinking of the USS Maine also occurs. This is another cause of the Spanish-American War. So the sinking of the USS Maine is where our U.S. battleship is down there. It's in the Havana Harbor in Cuba. It's meant to go down there and observe, which means it's supposed to watch and see what's going on between the Spanish rule of Cuba and the people of Cuba. So the U.S. ship mysteriously blows up, and we automatically think that the Spanish government blew it up. So we blame Spain for the USS Maine. The yellow journalism is another cause of the Spanish-American War. And yellow journalism is tabloid reporting. So what a tabloid reporter does is they take a little bit of a truth and then they spin this huge big story around it. It's like every time the swimsuit season's coming, they always say some celebrity has gained 100 pounds in 2 weeks. Yeah, they might have gained 2 pounds, but they didn't gain 100 pounds. But see, there's some truth in there. They did gain some weight, but they certainly did not gain 100 pounds, okay? So the next question that we looked at is defining journalism and naming 2 yellow journalists. So yellow journalism is just tabloid reporting, which I just explained, and the 2 big guys is William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. Both of these guys pretty much owned most of the American newspapers during this time period. So when you actually published your whatever they published their stories, it was their take on it. It was a very biased media system going on. So the next question, question 54, is what happened to Queen Liliuokalani in the late 1800s? Queen Liliuokalani is the Queen of Hawaii. And what ends up happening is the white sugar plantation owners overthrow her. And those white sugar plantation owners are Americans who are living abroad. They're living in this foreign country of Hawaii. Once they overthrow Queen Liliuokalani with the U.S. help, what ends up happening is Hawaii becomes a separate nation, the Republic of Hawaii. And then in 1898, the U.S. is going to raise tariffs, which is a tax on an imported good. And all that sugar that was coming from the Republic of Hawaii was a foreign good coming into our country. So the white sugar plantation owners, who are former Americans, decided it would be better to be in the United States. And so what ends up happening is the U.S. will annex Hawaii. We will add it to our country in 1898 under President McKinley. What is the Great White Fleet and the President? The Great White Fleet just refers to the U.S. Navy, and President Theodore Roosevelt, who believes in, walking softly but carrying a big stick, President Theodore Roosevelt is going to send the Great White Fleet around the world as a show of strength. So when he sends the Great White Fleet around the world, it is a modern Navy. The U.S. has modernized our Navy, and it shows that the U.S. is an imperial power, that no one will mess with us and not have some sort of repercussions. Theodore Roosevelt sends the U.S. Navy around. He sends it around like Latin America and Asia. When it gets to Asia, Japan looks at our Great White Fleet and they start building up too. And this is one of the big long-term effects is World War II. The Japanese feel threatened by this show of strength, not just by the US, but by all the other European powers who are also over in the Asian area. And so they're going to build up their fleet and they're going to build up their military and they become a very militaristic Japan, which is why it's so hard to beat them in World War II. So which president, and explain each. Big stick diplomacy is Theodore Roosevelt, so Teddy Roosevelt, TR. And this is basically saying the U.S. will police the world and enforce our policies. So if you owe the United States money, you better pay up or you're going to see the U.S. military in your backyard shortly. And we have the ability to do it because we have the Great White Fleet now. So we have this modern Navy. They can go anywhere. We're putting military bases everywhere that we take over too. So we've positioned ourselves nicely to police the world. Dollar diplomacy is by William Howard Taft, and this is basically going to say that the U.S. will invest money in Latin America and China. And basically we build a lot of railroads in the area, and it really does help our trade. So what it is basically an insurance policy for American businessmen. So if an American business guy wants to invest money in Latin America, it's not a big deal. He can invest money in it. And if, let's say the country rebels against the U.S., don't worry about it. The U.S. has got your back. It's an insurance policy. You're going to get your money back. Essentially, that's what they're saying. So what territories did the U.S. acquire as a result of the Spanish-American War? Remember, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Okay, so if you remember, Guam is still one of our territories. Same thing with Puerto Rico. It becomes another territory. We still own Guam and Puerto Rico. The Philippines will have their little kind of rebellion, and we will promise to go ahead and give them their freedom. And the Philippines becomes a separate country. They become an independent nation in 1946 after World War II. What is the message of the Roosevelt Corollary? All right, so remember, Roosevelt's kind of an aggressive guy, so his basic message is pay the U.S. any debts you owe us, or we're going to collect it with U.S. weapons and guns. So the next question we look at is question 59. What was the open door policy and why did it end in 1949? And who was the president that reopened trade in 1973? So you see I got a lot of connections in this one question, but I need you to start being able to take something that happened 100 years ago and bring it forward to modern times, okay? That's what real history does. So when we look at what was the open door policy, China is going to trade with the US and all other European powers, whether they like it or not. So Secretary of State John Hayes comes up with the open door policy, and basically what we say is we're all going to share in China. So the US isn't going to dominate it, Europe's not going to dominate it, we're all going to have a sphere of influence in the actual China area. We all get to trade in China, we all get to trade as equals. Now, this is going to end in 1949 because China becomes communist under Mao Zedong. And so when Mao leads his communist rebellion, the US will end all official communication, economic trade. We have nothing more to do with China until 1973 when President Richard Nixon is going to open up trade again with China. So he'll reopen trade in 1973, and he does it because the economy is not very strong in 1970s. So goal 7, progressivism. We need to name 3 methods used to prevent African Americans from voting, and you have to identify each. Remember, black citizens after the Civil War during Reconstruction time are discriminated against. Here's 3 ways. The literacy test. You had to be able to read in order to vote. And now remember what they did, would they give you like an ancient Greek test, a Latin test? I mean, not that many people actually know how to read ancient Greek or Latin, and if they do, they're historians. Poll tax is another thing that's going to be used against African Americans, but it also being used against whites, poor whites. So a poll tax is you have to pay in order to vote. And remember, if you're really poor and you have to pay in order to say what you would like to have for your president or your Senate, or I mean, like, you're just not going to do it. If it's going to cost you a meal, you're certainly not going to go vote. And if the literacy test and the poll tax didn't keep you away, then they have the grandfather clause. And this basically says if your grandfather was eligible to vote before 1867, then you could vote. This effectively eliminated all African Americans from voting because before 1867, you had African Americans, yes, in 1865, all slaves are free, but they were not US citizens until after 1867, and they hadn't been given voting rights. So they never were eligible to actually vote before that timeline. So essentially what this whole like disenfranchisement of African Americans basically means, it means if you're white, it's all right. And I know that sounds horrible, but that's exactly what this is. Because a poll tax, a literacy test, those got like exempted for the white citizens because of the grandfather clause. These things were meant to keep white men supreme. These things are racist. So define muckrakers and explain how they relate to the progressive era. So when you look at defining muckrakers, remember they're investigative journalists, and that means they go in and they look at the corruption, the filth of society. That's why they're called muckrakers. So they look at the corruption in the business world, the government, and they look during the progressive period, which is an era of reform for us. During the progressive era, we're going to move forward. So progress means to move forward or to do better in life. So that's what they're going to do. So like Ida Tarbell, Upton Sinclair, these people are going to expose what's wrong with our country, and then we're going to do new laws and reforms based on it. What was the Sherman Antitrust Act, and what was the problem associated with it? So the Sherman Antitrust Act basically stated that trusts are illegal. The only problem with the law is it never said exactly what a trust was. And remember, you have to define what a trust is and if you're going to actually break it up. So it never stated what a trust was, so it was impossible to enforce. One of the biggest things about the Sherman Antitrust Act is that the industrialists read it and they're like, oh, well, unions are trying to control a business because they're trying to control their pay, their hours, and their working conditions. So that sounds like they're trying to actually control an industry. So the big business guys, the robber barons, the captains of industry, they use the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up trust, to break up unions. I mean, like, it's amazing that they could do that. So the Clayton Antitrust Act is eventually going to replace it. It will be done in 1917, but it takes President Woodrow Wilson to do the Clayton Antitrust Act, and then when he does the Clayton Antitrust Act, he will say that unions are not trust. See, the industrialists read this, and they were smart, and they said unions are trust. Trust are unions. So what was the Niagara Movement? Remember, the Niagara Movement is founded by W.E.B. Du Bois, or Du Bois, whichever one you want to say. And so it's a movement of African Americans who are intellectuals. They have high college education degrees. And so they create the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Persons. Please make sure you know that this group, the NAACP, is the group who's really going to fight a lot of the civil rights law cases.